welcome back to another episode of the Dylbozer's Den. And today we're going to be discussing the sophomore release from death metal come hardcore heavyweights, Umbra Vitae. Umbra Vitae is a super group of sorts, but using that phrase is controversial. I don't necessarily like using the phrase supergroup because it already just ties into it being one of two things. Either it's a glamour project for all these guys to get together and put different tracks together that maybe couldn't fit into their main projects, or it just turns into something that critics have decided to label it. But it's a group of guys that all come from very similar backgrounds, from underground and extreme metal bands, and all those bands have quite a lineage as well. You know, let's just go ahead and hit the lineup of this band. Obviously, you have Jacob Bannon from Converge, Wear Your Wounds, and many different projects, as well as his Death Wish record label, which this album has been released on. You have Sean Martin, formerly of Hatebreed fame, as well as currently of Twitching Tongues, and also of Wear Your Wounds. You have Mike McKenzie and Greg Weeks of the Red Chord. Mike is also in Wear Your Wounds, but you also have John Rice, who is kind of a drummer for hire currently. He's also in Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats. I know him most from his stint with Job for a Cowboy in their early years, but he's also done live work with the Red Chord. The band has already released one full-length record in 2020, which was kind of snake bit from the start, as the album released during the pandemic era. So the band really didn't get to play around with many of the songs, didn't get to play many live shows off that period. That album was very well received and very liked by me, although it did seem very rushed at times. You know, it was a shorter record. It's about 28 minutes long, less than 30 minutes. And it feels like the songs were just recorded and put to tape, because I'm sure there were a lot of distancing issues and protocols with the pandemic that had to be put in place during the recording and mixing of that record. What we're now met with is a refined full-length record in the sophomore release. And the title of this is Light of Death. The title Light of Death meets where Shadow of Life lets off, because Umbra Vitae means Shadow of Life. So that prior release was almost like a self-titled release. But with Light of Death, you kind of get a balance there. That last album, as I said, was a little bit shorter. This is a fully realized release. It's about 46 minutes in length, 15 tracks, quite a few. But the differences in that first record sounding very abrasive, and maybe more abrasive than this, but this is more refined and more meat and potatoes kind of riffing. That's the subtle difference, is they're both very good records. I loved that first release. This one is definitely a more refined and realized project. It's like the band had more time to sit with these songs and put them through the editing phase and, testing things out and moving things around. Typical songwriting stuff of bands. And what's great about this release is you actually have songwriting going on. You have hooks. You have almost straightforward song structure on a lot of these songs. We know how Jake Bannon sounds with his main band Converge, just this unhinged animal, but you get very similar textures of what he sounds like with Converge, because he's a very recognizable voice. It's hard for him to cover up what he sounds like. It's not like he can do something and not sound like him, but you get him all over this record. You even get some experimental points in there, but let's dig into the production. Kurt Ballou not only recorded, he engineered and he mixed the album. As we're aware, he shares a band with Jake, as well as owner of God City Studios. Zach Weeks did additional engineering in this, and Zach Weeks has worked with Gatecreeper, High on Fire, Russian Circles, all in their most recent releases, two of which I have already reviewed and are in the can. So if you want to take a look at those, please do. We've also got Brad Boatwright doing the mastering job on this, and he has worked on a couple releases from 200 Stab Wounds, some releases from All Pigs Must Die, I believe the newest release from Black Tusk. You've got a pretty heavyweight lineup here, not only with the band's lineup, but with the production side of it. Artwork is done by Jake Bannon. I mean, I don't really have to dig into that. Everybody knows his artwork. If you've seen it, you've seen his artwork everywhere. It's recognizable. He's worked with many, many, many bands, and he's had many, many, many ripoffs done of his art stylings. I don't think you get the world of extreme hardcore metal, post-metal styling artwork without his hand. He's had a huge hand in all of that. And this album is no different. As I spoke on before, a lot of these songs are very well structured. It's verse, chorus, verse, repeat, which I like, but it still sounds interesting. You got songs like Leave of Absence, which really demonstrates the band's ability to fully dive into death metal roots and fully dive into traditional songwriting structures and create a really catchy thing. It definitely seems like the band has been listening to a lot of Florida death metal bands. This track itself is full of Slayer harmonies, which are all over the record as well. You know, Mike and Sean do a great job of blending these guitar stylings and adding different textures from their prior bands or their current bands that they're in. But with Leave of Absence, you really get a great standoff point for the whole record. Belief is Obsolete sounds like Entombed immediately coming in, very Swedish sounding parts, kicking it off, Swedish death metal. This is where I really started to notice how catchy the songs were. The hooks are there. The title of the song is often the hook, which I love. It's straight to the point. This thing is full of mosh riffs, like on this track at 1:17 in. Clear Cutter, another excellent track, cements really hard that this is a death metal release and almost makes you feel like it may be only a death metal album, but we get to the point that it's much more varied than just a straightforward death metal album. The dissonance is here, and as with a lot of releases this year and in the last year, a lot of bands are embracing dissonance a lot more. Probably listening to bands like Krallice or early metalcore bands such as Botch, Coalesce, Converge for that fact. I mean, it's hard not to have that when you're in this band. Anti-Spirit Machine, this is the one that sounds like a hardcore track to me. You know, again, those hooks are coming back as I mentioned before. What I really like about this record are the guitar solos. I'm not the biggest guitar solo fan. I think a lot of it just bores me. It's just mindless kind of drivel. And that goes with a lot of classic bands and everything like that. And I know that's going to ruffle feathers, but there's not a lot of catchiness to them when I hear it. Every so often I'll hear a solo that really sticks out to me. But these are really well done. A lot of just very shred-tastic stuff without sounding like wank. It's not Yngwie Malmsteen, probably more on par with maybe even a George Lynch, like a Nuno Bettencourt. Some of those guys that had a little bit more character in their playing. I'd never in a million years would ever have thought I'd mention those two names talking about an extreme metal / hardcore record like this. It's a very meat and potatoes record with a lot of experimentation that comes on the back end of the record. On the experimental side of things, I really started to notice this on tracks like Past Tense that has these like snaky kind of lumbering riffs with this double kick just going right into it. And those snaky riffs really remind me of Mike's prior projects. And it really sticks with a lot of the different riffs that are on the album that he does that in, and it adds this different texture to it. So Mike is an unsung hero in guitar riffing, I think. He's a left-handed guy and plays a lot of upstrokes, which adds this very percussive and gnarly sound to it. It's fucking wild to watch him play. And he's a very, very good riff writer and a very good guitar player. He needs to start singing the praise that he duly deserves. On this track, you've also got who I think needs a lot of credit as well is John Rice. John Rice is all over this record. He ties it all in. He knows when to play. He also knows when to go completely over the top and play shit that is going to make it catchy. That guy's one of the best drummers I've ever heard. A lot of names get brought up. A lot of different names throughout the years will be brought up about who's the best drummer, and that's all debatable, but John Rice is a really good drummer, and I don't think gets a lot of attention because he was in a band called Job for a Cowboy, which again, that's your problem. If you can't pay attention to really good drumming, get over it. This guy is fucking great. He's played live with every band you could ever imagine, and he's done a really good, proficient job at it. If not just proficient, but amazing job at it. So this record is no slouch. You know, if you listen to this record and pull one thing from it, other than it being really good songs, the thing I would want to pull is how good the drum performance is on this record. Talking about, you know, the different aspects of how this album starts to get experimental, you see a track like Past Tense, and then you go into Velvet Black, which is close to a sludge metal song as you're going to get. Sounds like Jake is definitely channeling like a Kirk Winstein or a Dax Riggs, or even, for lack of a better word, a little bit of Phil Anselmo with some of the affected vocal lines on here. This is the first track where you can go, this is just a dyed-in-the-wool like heavy metal ballad without it just being cheesy. You know, there's a lot of weight to this track. You know, Sean Martin, with his background in Hatebreed, 100 Demons, currently of Twitching Tongues, knows his way around just a riff, knows his way around structuring these heavy, heavy songs and bringing just kind of the thickener to that. What a great person to have in this band. Sean has had some background already working with Jake, obviously Wear Your Wounds, but I believe the first time I heard Sean playing on a Converge track was on the Axe to Fall record. I think he's on the track Dark Horse. I could be wrong in that, but he's on the album nonetheless. But Velvet Black, man, what a different sounding track. Kind of the first time I heard it, I almost got some nu metal vibes to it, but the more you listen to it, it's like it's definitely a sludge track. It goes along the lines of the sludge category that I described to it. And I think if you put a sludge record in front of all these guys, one of these guys is going to end up going, yeah, I'm a big fan of that band, or I'm a big fan of this band. Where you've got these experimental tracks, you still have all of the kind of fast-paced tracks like 2020 Vision, Algorithm Fear, which touches a little bit on black metal chord voicings and these and guitar harmonies, which aren't overused on the record. Empty Vessel, which is basically a grindcore track that has this great mosh groove riff at the end of it that I could see people just beating the hell out of each other to. But then you go into my favorite track on the whole record, which is Cause and Effect. This is probably the opus on the record, or the epic track on the record. Starts out with Spanish guitar, goes right into these heavy pounding, not droning, but melodic and just very chord structured portions that the bass is just carrying and filling in the blanks on this. It's very open sounding. You know, Greg Weeks is a very good bass player that doesn't get talked about. He's not very flashy, but he definitely knows what he's doing. And he's got some parts in here that definitely lock in the rhythm section together and bring the songs more impact to them. This is the track to me that would throw people off on the album, because it does sound like two separate songs, but they blend it so well. Maybe even got some like Danzig vibes off of this, mainly just the kind of writing style off those first 2 or 3 records of his. And then it blends with, you know, Death and Grind, like right there in the middle, just blast beats aplenty. Excellent fucking track. Deep End sounds like Emperor and Dissection right out the gate. Very melodic, blackened death metal there. I'm wondering if that might be Mike McKenzie's influence to this, because he's fans of bands like Ruin of Everest, etc. This is also a track that I really put together in my head that everybody gets a moment to shine on this album without overstepping their bounds. You know, everybody gets a little bit of textures of themselves. It doesn't sound like they're having to create something that isn't what they normally would create. Nature versus Nurture, groovy track, death metal is all. There's a point in this song where John Rice just fucking wings it and goes off the deep end with these drum fills and everything. You know, I'm not a very drum centric person, but when I notice a really good drummer and I know a really good drummer, I have to pay the fuck attention. You get to the back portion of this record and you really start to see that the sounds that are being brought into this album come from vastly different influences rather than just hardcore and death metal. And a song like Fatal Flaw, which you really start to get these big octave chords being used, and which is very reminiscent of like a Morbid Angel or an Immolation. And you get these nasty sounding riffs in this portion of it. Final track, Light of Death, which is the title track on the album. Sounds like Immolation immediately, almost sounds like Domination era Morbid Angel. On these last 2 tracks, Fatal Flaw and Light of Death, you also get the outros of each track using the intro of the very first track as a way to tie the album together and also, you know, bring forth that, hey, you've gone through an experience. It's going to begin and end the very same way. It makes me think of a lot of modern horror soundtracks in particular, stuff by Robert Eggers, Ari Aster. You know, those 2 guys are very keen to use very uncomforting, sickening sounding soundtracks to them to portray the trauma. This is a great fucking record from a band that hopefully nobody will shrug off as just a simple supergroup. I think these guys are going to end up putting music out quite a bit. They're doing some live shows right now. Hopefully we get to see them in our neck of the woods. 2 big things that I took away from this album in whole is what I've mentioned throughout the whole review is that 1, these guys all sound good together. 2, John Rice is a fucking great drummer. This is an album full of really great songs. You could pull a lot of tracks from this record and go, that could be a single, that could be a single, that could be a single. You could almost split the record into 2 separate EPs because they sound so vastly different. What I do love about this, you've got 2 different groups of songs. You've got like straightforward death/grind tracks, and then you've got these experimental tracks that are kind of filtered throughout. Tracks like Velvet Black, Past Tense, Fatal Flaw, Light of Death, Cause and Effect. It's a varied record without sounding like a polar opposite album. Everything in it fits the way it needs to be fit. It's a great representation of where this band is now and probably what the band wanted to sound like with their first record. Let me know what you thought about the record. Hopefully everybody enjoys this record. Thank you guys for joining in. Check us out on Instagram, X, Facebook, You can catch me with more reviews from the Dylbozer's Den every Friday. And you can also catch us every single Wednesday with the Riff Worship Podcast. Again, thank you guys so much.